History remembers William the Conqueror as the Norman Duke who changed England forever. He is celebrated in textbooks as the victor of the Battle of Hastings in 1066, the man who unified a fractured kingdom and brought continental governance to the British Isles. His name is carved into monuments, his deeds immortalized in the Bayeux Tapestry. Yet behind this carefully constructed legacy of triumph lies a far darker truth, one written in blood, ash, and the screams of thousands who dared to resist his iron rule. William was not merely a conqueror in the military sense. He was an architect of terror, a strategist who understood that fear could accomplish what armies alone could not. His methods were calculated, systematic, and designed to break the spirit of an entire people. From the smouldering ruins of northern England to the gallows where English nobles met their end, William's reign was marked by acts of cruelty that shocked even the hardened rulers of medieval Europe. This was a man who ordered the destruction of entire regions, who wielded starvation as a weapon, and who demonstrated through unflinching brutality that resistance would be met not with mercy, but with annihilation. The chronicles of his time, penned by monks who witnessed the devastation firsthand, speak of horrors that transcended the norms of medieval warfare. Orderic Vitalis, a Norman chronicler who had no reason to slander his own people's king, wrote with visible anguish about the atrocities committed in William's name. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled by English scribes, documented the suffering in prose that trembled with barely contained rage. Even William of Malmesbury, writing decades later with the benefit of historical distance, could not disguise his revulsion at what the conqueror had unleashed upon England. What follows is not a tale of glorious conquest, but a forensic examination of 7 specific acts that define William's true legacy, a legacy built on scorched earth, severed limbs, and mass graves. These are not myths or legends embellished by time. They are documented historical facts, corroborated by multiple sources and archaeological evidence that continues to surface nearly a millennium later. Each act reveals a different facet of William's ruthlessness: his willingness to commit genocide to secure power, his use of mutilation as political theater, his contempt for the sanctity of human life when it stood between him and absolute control. This is the story of how one man's ambition transformed an entire kingdom into a landscape of terror. It is the story of villages erased from existence, of children who starved because William ordered every source of food destroyed, of men who were blinded and castrated for the crime of defending their homeland. It is the story of how medieval Europe, no stranger to violence, recoiled in horror at the systematic brutality of the Norman conquest. And it is the story of how William the Conqueror earned a second, darker title in the whispered conversations of his terrified subjects: William the Bastard, who proved that cruelty, when wielded with sufficient determination, could indeed conquer a nation. The blood has long since dried on the stones of England's castles. The ashes of burned villages have been scattered by centuries of wind. But the memory of what William did, what he ordered, what he permitted, what he justified, remains embedded in the historical record like a scar that refuses to fade. This is that record. This is the true cost of conquest. This is the legacy that textbooks often choose to omit. Welcome to the dark side of 1066. Welcome to the reign of William the Conqueror. Let us begin. The Harrying of the North, a campaign of systematic genocide. In the winter of 1069, William faced his greatest challenge since Hastings. The north of England, that wild and defiant region beyond the Humber, had risen in open rebellion. Anglo-Saxon nobles, Danish raiders, and Scottish opportunists had formed an unlikely alliance, united by their hatred of Norman rule. They had stormed York, massacred the Norman garrison, and declared their independence from William's authority. For a king whose power rested entirely on the perception of invincibility, This was not merely a military setback, it was an existential threat that demanded a response so overwhelming, so total, that no one would ever dare rebel again. What William unleashed upon northern England in the months that followed would become known to history as the Harrying of the North, a campaign of devastation so complete, so merciless, that it would leave scars visible in the archaeological record nearly 1,000 years later. This was not war in the medieval sense, where armies clashed and castles were besieged. This was deliberate, calculated genocide. William ordered his armies to destroy not just the rebel forces, but the very capacity of the North to sustain human life. Every village, every farm, every source of food and shelter was to be obliterated. The goal was not conquest, it was extinction. The campaign began with methodical precision. Norman forces organized into mobile columns swept through Yorkshire, Durham, Northumbria, and parts of what is now Cumbria and Lancashire. They carried specific orders: burn every building, slaughter every animal, destroy every tool that could be used for farming. Standing crops were set ablaze in the fields. Stored grain was scattered and burned. Plows were smashed. Mills were demolished. Fishing boats were sunk. Orchards that had taken decades to mature were cut down or burned. Even seed grain, the precious reserve that farmers set aside to plant next year's crop, was destroyed or contaminated. William was not satisfied with victory. He wanted to make survival itself impossible. Orderic Vitalis, a Norman monk writing in the early 12th century, documented what followed with prose that could barely contain his horror. He described how the survivors, those who had managed to flee the advancing Norman armies, began to starve as winter tightened its grip. With no shelter, no food, and no means to acquire either, tens of thousands of people faced a choice between starvation and cannibalism. Orderic wrote of finding bodies on the roads, of corpses half-eaten by the desperate living, of parents who had killed and consumed their own children rather than watch them die slowly of hunger. The chronicler, normally restrained in his judgments, abandoned all pretense of objectivity. He called the harrying of the North a crime that stained William's soul, an act for which the king would answer to God. The Domesday Book, compiled 17 years later in 1086, provides chilling statistical evidence of the devastation. Entry after entry in the northern sections notes simply waste, land that had been productive before 1069 but was now abandoned, depopulated, incapable of generating any revenue for the crown. Entire villages had vanished, their names preserved only in the Domesday Survey. Modern historians, analyzing the data with demographic models, estimate that between 100,000 and 150,000 people died as a direct result of the harrying, roughly 5 to 10% of England's entire population at the time. To put this in perspective, it would be equivalent to a modern government deliberately causing the death of millions of its own citizens. Archaeological excavations in Yorkshire and Durham have uncovered physical evidence that corroborates the written accounts. Excavated villages show clear signs of sudden abandonment around 1069-1070, with hearths left cold midwinter and tools discarded where they lay. Pollen analysis of peat bogs reveals a dramatic change in vegetation patterns during this period, with cultivated species disappearing and being replaced by wild grasses and scrub, evidence that farming had ceased entirely across vast regions. Mass graves discovered near former village sites contain bodies showing signs of malnutrition and disease consistent with famine. The land itself bears witness to what was done. Contemporary observers across Europe reacted with shock when news of the harrying reached them. Pope Alexander II, who had blessed William's invasion in 1066, reportedly expressed grave concern about the scale of the devastation. The King of France, Philip I, used the atrocity to vilify William in diplomatic correspondence, calling him a tyrant who ruled through terror rather than law. Even William's own Norman nobility seemed troubled. Several sources suggest that some Norman lords quietly protested the severity of the campaign, though none dared do so openly. The harrying had exceeded the bounds of acceptable medieval violence, crossing the invisible line that separated warfare from wanton slaughter. William himself never expressed regret. According to later accounts, when confronted with the moral implications of what he had ordered, he is said to have replied that harsh measures were necessary to establish peace, a chilling example of how rulers throughout history have justified atrocities in the name of stability. But the true measure of the harrying's impact lies not in William's rationalizations, but in the decades it took for northern England to recover. Some regions remained depopulated for generations. The North's economy, which had been vibrant and productive before 1069, did not fully recover until well into the 12th century. William had wanted to break the North's will to resist. He succeeded, but the price was paid in mass graves, in villages that would never be rebuilt, in a trauma that echoed through generations. The harrying of the North was not merely one of William's crimes. It was, by any reasonable definition, genocide. Mutilation as statecraft, the politics of severed limbs. In medieval Europe, the human body was more than flesh and bone. It was a canvas upon which power could be written. Kings and nobles understood that punishment, when properly displayed, could serve as both retribution and deterrent. But even by the brutal standards of the 11th century, William the Conqueror's systematic use of mutilation as a tool of governance shocked his contemporaries. He did not merely execute rebels, he maimed them, blinded them, castrated them, and then released them to live as walking advertisements for the consequences of defiance. These were not spontaneous acts of violence committed in the heat of battle. They were deliberate, calculated performances of power, stage-managed to instill terror throughout his realm. The practice of judicial mutilation was not new to the 11th century, but William weaponized it with unprecedented zeal. Under Anglo-Saxon law, mutilation had been reserved for specific crimes. Thieves might lose a hand, perjurers a tongue. But William expanded both the scope and scale of such punishments, applying them liberally to anyone who challenged Norman authority. More importantly, he understood the theatrical dimension of public mutilation. Victims were not simply maimed and discarded. They were maimed in public squares, in front of assembled crowds, with the explicit intention of creating spectacles of suffering that would be discussed and feared throughout the kingdom. One of the most extensively documented cases involves the rebels of Exeter in 1068. When the city finally surrendered after a prolonged siege, William's vengeance was swift and theatrical. According to William of Malmesbury, the king ordered the blinding of several prominent citizens who had led the resistance. The procedure, primitive and agonizing, involved heating metal rods until they glowed red, then pressing them directly into the victim's eyes, destroying the corneas and optic nerves. The victims were then paraded through the streets before being released to stumble blind through the countryside, living reminders of what awaited those who opposed the Norman king. The message was unmistakable. William could rob you of your sight, of your most basic connection to the world, and force you to live on as a testament to his power. Castration served a different symbolic function, one rooted in medieval concepts of masculinity and dynastic power. For noble rebels, particularly those with claims to lands or titles, castration was not just physical torture, it was genealogical annihilation. A castrated man could father no heirs, could establish no dynasty, could not pass on his name or his claim to future generations. When William ordered the castration of captured English nobles, he was not merely punishing individuals, he was erasing bloodlines, severing the threads that connected Anglo-Saxon aristocracy to their ancestral lands. Several chronicles record instances where entire groups of captive nobles were castrated en masse, their severed testicles sometimes displayed publicly as grotesque trophies. The amputation of hands and feet served yet another purpose: the creation of living symbols of powerlessness. A man without hands could not wield a sword, could not work a plow, could barely feed himself. A man without feet could not walk, could not flee, could not stand as an equal among his peers. These mutilations transformed proud warriors and prosperous farmers into dependent beggars, objects of pity rather than respect. Orderic Vitalis describes encountering such men on the roads of Normandy and England, former soldiers reduced to crawling on stumps, former craftsmen unable to practice their trades, all bearing William's mark upon their bodies. What made William's use of mutilation particularly effective was its combination with mercy, or rather, the perverse imitation of mercy. Unlike execution, which was final and could create martyrs, mutilation allowed victims to survive and spread fear. William seemed to grasp instinctively that a blind man stumbling through a marketplace or a castrated noble forced to watch his estates pass to Norman lords was more valuable than a corpse in a grave. These maimed survivors became involuntary propagandists for Norman power, their ruined bodies more eloquent than any proclamation. Every person who saw them was reminded, this is what happens to those who resist. And unlike a corpse that could be buried and forgotten, a mutilated victim remained visible, a permanent exhibit in William's Museum of Terror. The practice extended beyond political rebels to common criminals, particularly those guilty of poaching on Norman-controlled hunting grounds. Forest law, imported from Normandy and imposed with rigid severity, made hunting royal game a capital offence, or worse. Poachers caught in the king's forests faced blinding castration or the amputation of fingers, hands, or feet, depending on William's mood and the perceived severity of the offence. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records bitter complaints about these punishments, noting that Englishmen were being mutilated for trying to feed their families by hunting deer in forests their ancestors had freely used for centuries. William had turned entire regions into exclusive hunting preserves, and the bodies of English peasants paid the price for his sport. The long-term psychological impact of William's mutilation campaign cannot be quantified, but it permeates the sources. English writers describe a kingdom living in constant fear, where men were afraid to speak freely, to gather in groups, to question Norman authority in even the mildest terms. The threat of mutilation hung over every interaction with Norman officials like an invisible blade, and that was precisely William's intention. He had discovered that you did not need to mutilate everyone to control everyone. You only needed to mutilate enough people in sufficiently public ways to make the threat ubiquitous. In this sense, every blind beggar, every castrated noble, every handless peasant was not just a victim but a tool, an instrument through which William maintained his grip on a conquered and traumatized population. The body politic of England had been inscribed with the signature of its conqueror, written in scar tissue and missing limbs, a text that could be read by all and forgotten by none. The Great Dispossession, erasing Anglo-Saxon England. Conquest is often measured in battles won and territories claimed, but William the Conqueror understood that true domination required something more fundamental, the complete restructuring of who owned England itself. In the 2 decades following Hastings, William orchestrated one of history's most thorough transfers of wealth and land, systematically stripping the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy of their ancestral estates and redistributing them to his Norman followers. This was not merely confiscation, it was cultural genocide accomplished through legal mechanisms, the erasure of an entire ruling class written into charters and sealed with wax, made permanent through the meticulous record-keeping that would culminate in the Domesday Book. Before 1066, England had been governed by a complex network of Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Danish nobles whose families had held their lands for generations, sometimes for centuries. These were the Thanes, the Earls, the minor nobility whose estates formed the economic and political foundation of pre-conquest England. Their power rested on ancient traditions of land tenure, on customary rights that predated written law, on networks of kinship and obligation that stretched back to the days of Alfred the Great. By 1086, When the Domesday survey was complete, this entire class had been almost completely eliminated. Only two significant Anglo-Saxon landholders remained in possession of substantial estates. Less than 5% of the land was still in English hands. The rest had been given to Normans. The mechanism of dispossession was brutally simple but legally sophisticated. William declared himself the rightful heir to Edward the Confessor, claiming that all land in England belonged to the crown by right of conquest and succession. He then graciously granted these lands to his followers as fiefs, holding them in exchange for military service and loyalty. This Norman feudal system replaced the more fluid Anglo-Saxon arrangement at a stroke, and any English noble who wished to retain his land had to petition the king for a regrant, essentially begging to receive back as a gift what had been his family's property by ancient right. Many were refused. Those who were granted back some portion of their lands discovered they now held them on completely different terms, subject to Norman law and Norman customs they barely understood. But most Anglo-Saxon nobles never got the chance to petition. William employed a variety of pretexts to justify wholesale confiscation. Any nobleman who had fought at Hastings or in any subsequent rebellion automatically forfeited all his lands. Those who had supported Harold Godwinson, even passively, were deemed traitors. Those who failed to immediately swear fealty to William lost everything. Those who swore fealty, but were later accused of plotting against the king, accusations that were easy to manufacture and impossible to disprove, were stripped of their estates. Even those who managed to retain some land in the early years often lost it later, as Norman pressure and legal chicanery gradually whittled away their holdings until they were left with nothing. The human impact of this dispossession was catastrophic. Entire families who had been wealthy and powerful found themselves landless, penniless, reduced to refugee status in their own country. Some fled to Scotland, to Scandinavia, to the continent, carrying with them bitter tales of Norman treachery. Others stayed and tried to make their peace with the new order, accepting minor positions in the households of Norman lords who now ruled their ancestral lands. Still others turned to brigandage, becoming the outlaws and resistance fighters who populate English folklore. Men like Hereward the Wake, whose desperate guerrilla campaign in the Fens became legendary precisely because it was so exceptional, so hopeless, so doomed. The beneficiaries of this massive redistribution were William's Norman followers, a relatively small group of opportunistic warriors and administrators who found themselves suddenly among the wealthiest men in Europe. The Domesday Book allows us to track this transformation with shocking precision. William Fitzosborne, the king's closest friend, received vast estates across multiple counties. Robert of Morton, William's half-brother, became one of the largest landholders in England. Odo of Bayeux, another half-brother and a bishop, accumulated enough wealth to rival the king himself. Lesser Norman knights who had gambled everything on the invasion found themselves lords of English manors, ruling over English peasants who could barely pronounce their foreign names. The psychological impact of this dispossession extended far beyond the aristocracy. English peasants watched as the local lords they had known all their lives were replaced by French-speaking foreigners who knew nothing of English customs and cared nothing for English welfare. Norman lords imposed their own agricultural practices, their own legal systems, their own expectations of rent and service. The familiar rhythms of rural life were disrupted. Traditional agreements between lord and tenant, often based on verbal understandings passed down through generations, were swept aside in favor of written contracts in Latin that few Englishmen could read. Villages that had operated with a degree of autonomy found themselves under rigid Norman control, their movements restricted, their obligations increased, their ancient rights dismissed as irrelevant under the new regime. The dispossession was so total, so systematic, that it fundamentally altered the trajectory of English history. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, which had survived Viking invasions, dynastic upheavals, and civil wars, was erased in a single generation. With it went not just land and wealth, but cultural continuity. The English language, once the language of law and literature, became the tongue of peasants and servants. English artistic traditions, architectural styles and literary forms were marginalized or abandoned. England became, for a time, a colony of Normandy, governed by foreigners for the benefit of foreigners, its native population reduced to second-class status in the land of their birth. And all of this was accomplished not through random pillage, but through careful planning, through legal documents and administrative records, through the methodical application of a conqueror's will. William did not simply take England. He rewrote it property by property, charter by charter, until the England that had existed before 1066 was nothing but a memory preserved in the bitter complaints of a dispossessed people. Rivers of blood, the civilian massacres. Medieval warfare had rules, unwritten perhaps but generally understood. Armies fought armies, soldiers killed soldiers. Civilians, while often caught in the crossfire, were not typically targeted for systematic slaughter, not because medieval warriors were particularly humanitarian, but because civilians were valuable. They paid taxes, worked the land, produced the goods that made a territory worth conquering in the first place. A wise conqueror preserved the civilian population because they represented future revenue. William the Conqueror was a wise man in many respects, but his invasion of England revealed a brutal pragmatism that overrode such considerations. When faced with resistance, William did not hesitate to order the massacre of civilians on a scale that shocked even his own contemporaries. The massacres began almost immediately after Hastings. As William's army advanced through southeastern England in late 1066, they encountered scattered resistance from English militias and outraged peasants. William's response was disproportionate and decisive. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were burned to the ground, with their inhabitants inside. Men of fighting age were rounded up and executed, often by hanging, sometimes by more creative methods designed to maximize terror. Women and children were not spared if they were caught in towns that resisted. Contemporary sources describe indiscriminate killing in the streets, bodies left to rot as warnings to other communities considering resistance. This was not the fog of war, it was deliberate policy. The most extensively documented massacre occurred at the Siege of Exeter in 1068. After the city surrendered following a bitter 18-day siege, William reportedly ordered a selective purge of the population. The city's leaders were punished with the mutilations described earlier, but beyond that, Norman soldiers were given license to exact revenge for the siege. How many died is uncertain. Chronicles offer contradictory numbers, but multiple sources agree that the streets ran with blood, that bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried, that the stench of death hung over Exeter for weeks. The massacre served its purpose. After Exeter, other English towns surrendered rather than face similar treatment. But individual massacres, horrific as they were, paled in comparison to William's systematic policy regarding survivors of conquered territories. Those who did not die in the initial violence often faced a fate that medieval observers considered worse: enslavement. The slave trade had been declining in much of Western Europe by the 11th century, but William's conquest produced a sudden glut of human merchandise. Thousands of English men, women and children were rounded up after rebellions, chained together in columns, and marched to ports for shipment to slave markets in Europe and the Mediterranean. The trade was so extensive that it drew complaints from religious authorities, including Archbishop Lanfranc of Canterbury, who protested the sale of Christians as slaves. The enslavement process itself was brutal and efficient. After a successful military campaign, Norman soldiers would sweep through the surrounding countryside, capturing anyone who had fled. Men were evaluated for their potential labor value. The young and strong were kept for heavy work or sold abroad, while the old and weak were often simply killed as economically worthless. Women and children were particularly valuable in the slave trade. Women for domestic service and sexual exploitation. Children because they could be trained and would provide years of labor. Families were separated without ceremony. Parents watched their children dragged away in chains. Spouses were sold to different buyers. These were not prisoners of war in any recognized sense. They were simply people who had the misfortune to live in the wrong place when William's army passed through. Some slaves remained in England, put to work building the castles that would symbolize Norman domination. The rapid construction of hundreds of Motte and Bailey fortifications across England in the decade after Hastings required enormous amounts of manual labor, digging ditches, moving earth, cutting timber, hauling stone. Much of this work was performed by enslaved English workers, toiling under Norman overseers, building the very structures that would ensure their continued subjugation. The irony was lost on no one. Archaeological excavations of some Norman construction sites have revealed burial pits containing bodies bearing signs of overwork, malnutrition, and untreated injuries, likely the remains of workers who did not survive the brutal pace of construction. The scale of the slave trade generated by William's conquest can be glimpsed in fragmentary records from continental markets. Bristol, a major English port, developed a notorious reputation as a center of the slave trade, with ships regularly departing for Ireland, Scandinavia, and beyond. Dublin's slave markets saw a significant influx of English captives in the years after 1066. Even Iceland's sagas make oblique references to English thralls acquired during this period. The human cost is incalculable, but conservative estimates suggest that tens of thousands of English people were enslaved as a direct result of William's invasion and the rebellions it provoked. What makes William's civilian massacres and enslavement policies particularly striking is their calculated nature. These were not atrocities committed by an army out of control, driven by bloodlust and looting instinct. They were deliberate strategies, authorized from the top, designed to accomplish specific political and economic goals. The massacres destroyed resistance. The enslavement punished rebellion while generating revenue and labor. Together, they created a climate of absolute terror that made further resistance seem suicidal. By 1070, the English population had learned a bitter lesson. Opposing William did not mean death in honest battle, but massacre if you fought, and slavery if you survived. It was a lesson written in the burned ruins of villages, in the empty spaces where towns had stood, in the faces of the chained columns of prisoners being marched to the coast. And it was a lesson that would not be forgotten for generations. Fortresses of oppression, the castle system. A castle is more than walls and towers. It is a statement of power made tangible, an architectural argument that cannot be refuted, a permanent assertion of dominance over the landscape and the people who inhabit it. William the Conqueror understood this with the clarity of genius. In the years following 1066, he ordered the construction of hundreds of castles across England, more fortifications built more quickly than in any comparable period in European history. These were not merely defensive structures designed to protect Norman garrisons. They were instruments of occupation, watchtowers from which foreign soldiers could survey conquered territory, symbols of subjugation visible for miles around. And for the English people forced to build them, to live beneath their shadows, the castles represented something else entirely, the permanent reality of their defeat. The construction process itself was an exercise in ruthless efficiency and brutal disregard for English welfare. When William decided a castle was needed in a particular location, no consideration was given to existing structures or inhabitants. Urban castles like those built in London, York, Lincoln, and Norwich required the demolition of entire neighborhoods. Hundreds of homes, churches, workshops, and businesses were simply cleared away to make room for fortifications. The displaced families received no compensation, no alternative housing. They were cast out into the streets, their property destroyed, their lives upended, all to accommodate the military needs of their conquerors. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records bitter complaints about these destructions, noting that ancient communities were erased overnight to serve Norman interests. The labor to build these castles came largely from forced English conscription. The Normans imported the continental practice of corvée labor, compulsory work owed to feudal lords, and applied it with ruthless enthusiasm. English peasants were ordered to abandon their farms during crucial planting or harvest seasons to dig ditches, move earth, cut timber, and haul stone for castle construction. Those who refused were punished, often with the mutilations described earlier. Those who complied found their livelihoods destroyed. Missing planting season meant no crop, which meant no food for the winter, which meant starvation for their families. The castles rose quickly, but they rose on the broken backs of English labor, each stone cemented with English suffering. Once completed, the castles served as bases for systematic oppression. Each fortress was garrisoned with Norman soldiers who had explicit license to enforce Norman law over the surrounding territory. These garrisons raided English villages with impunity, confiscating food, livestock, and goods as they pleased. English women were routinely assaulted by Norman soldiers who knew they would face no consequences. English men who protested were beaten, imprisoned, or killed. The castle became a symbol of injustice itself, a place where Englishmen were tried under foreign law they did not understand, sentenced by foreign judges who did not speak their language, punished according to Norman customs that bore no resemblance to Anglo-Saxon tradition. The psychological impact of living under castle surveillance cannot be overstated. In pre-conquest England, political power had been relatively diffuse. Local affairs were managed by local assemblies, and while there were certainly hierarchies and injustices, there was also a sense that English people had some agency in their own governance. The castles ended that illusion completely. Every English community within sight of a Norman fortress, which, given the density of castle construction, meant most communities, lived under the constant awareness of being watched, monitored, controlled. The castle on the hill was a permanent reminder that Norman soldiers could descend at any moment, that Norman law superseded English custom, that resistance was futile because the Normans had built their power into the very landscape. The strategic placement of castles reveals William's sophisticated understanding of occupation logistics. Major castles were built at key transportation nodes, river crossings, road junctions, coastal ports, where they could control movement and commerce. Secondary castles were positioned to create overlapping zones of control, ensuring that no region was beyond quick reach of Norman military force. The density was particularly high in areas that had shown rebellious tendencies. Yorkshire, after the harrying of the north, was ringed with castles. The Welsh marches bristled with fortifications. Even relatively peaceful regions received their share of Norman strongholds because William trusted no one and assumed that any English community might revolt if given the chance. The economic burden of the castle system fell overwhelmingly on the English. Not only were they forced to build the structures, but they were then required to support the garrisons that occupied them. Local populations had to provide food, fuel, and supplies for the Norman soldiers who oppressed them, a bitter irony that contemporary chroniclers noted with undisguised anger. The cost was ruinous. Villages that had been moderately prosperous before 1066 found themselves impoverished by the constant demands of nearby garrisons. The Domesday Book records numerous estates whose value had plummeted since the conquest, and castle construction and support is frequently cited as the cause. William had effectively created a system where the English paid for the infrastructure of their own subjugation. By 1086, England bristled with an estimated 500 to 600 castles, an astonishing number for a kingdom of its size. This represented one of the most intensive fortification programs in medieval history, comparable to what later colonial powers would build in conquered territories centuries later. And that comparison is apt, because William's castles served precisely the colonial function. They were forward operating bases in hostile territory, islands of Norman power in a sea of sullen English resentment. They transformed England's physical landscape while simultaneously transforming its political reality. Before the castles, English resistance seemed possible, even plausible. After the castles, rebellion meant confronting fortified positions manned by professional soldiers, an insurmountable tactical obstacle. The castles did not just dominate England's skyline, they dominated England's imagination, crushing hope with their mere presence. William had not merely conquered England, he had built his conquest into every valley and hilltop, making Norman dominance as permanent as stone itself. Sacred plunder, the violation of God's houses. In medieval Christendom, the church was supposed to be inviolate. Monasteries and churches were sanctuaries protected by divine law and human custom. To attack the church was not merely a crime against man, but a sin against God, an offense that would damn the perpetrator's immortal soul. Kings and warriors might slaughter each other with abandon, but they were expected to show reverence, or at least restraint, when it came to ecclesiastical property. William the Conqueror, who had secured papal blessing for his invasion and who would later be remembered as a pious benefactor of Norman monasteries, showed no such restraint when it came to English religious institutions. He looted them, taxed them, suppressed them, and when necessary destroyed them, all while maintaining the fiction of Christian virtue. The pillaging began immediately after Hastings, during William's march to London. Norman soldiers, operating with at least tacit approval from their commanders, raided monasteries and churches along the route, seizing gold and silver vessels, stripping altars of their ornaments, confiscating illuminated manuscripts for their jeweled covers, while discarding the priceless texts themselves. The justification, when one was offered, was that these were spoils of war, the legitimate rewards of victory. But the targets were not military installations. They were houses of worship, repositories of sacred art and learning, communities of monks and nuns who posed no military threat to anyone. The desecration was methodical and thorough, so much so that many English ecclesiastical institutions never recovered their pre-conquest wealth. What made William's treatment of the English church particularly egregious was its combination of material greed and political calculation. He understood that the church was not merely a religious institution, but a repository of wealth, learning, and cultural authority. By stripping English monasteries and bishoprics of their treasures, he simultaneously enriched his treasury and diminished the institutional capacity of potential centers of resistance. English monasteries had been strongholds of learning, producing the manuscripts and maintaining the schools that preserved Anglo-Saxon culture. By confiscating their wealth, William crippled their ability to continue this cultural work. The effect was to undermine not just the economic power of the English church, but its role as the guardian of English identity. The taxation of monasteries was particularly controversial. In 1070, William imposed extraordinary levies on English religious houses to fund his ongoing military campaigns and administrative reforms. These taxes were ruinous. Monasteries that had been self-sufficient for centuries found themselves forced to sell land, release servants, and reduce their charitable activities just to meet Norman demands. Some institutions had to pawn their remaining treasures, chalices, reliquaries, liturgical vessels, to foreign creditors. Contemporary monastic chroniclers, normally circumspect in their political commentary, expressed open outrage. Orderic Vitalis described the taxation as sacrilege. Edmund of Canterbury compared William to the biblical enemies of Israel, plunderers of the temple. These were not casual criticisms. They were accusations of impiety from within William's own Christian framework. William also systematically replaced English bishops and abbots with Norman appointees, a purge that was as much about control as about ecclesiastical reform. In the 2 decades following the conquest, nearly every significant position in the English church hierarchy was transferred to Norman clerics. English bishops were deposed on pretexts ranging from simony to incompetence to insufficient loyalty to the new regime. Their replacements were uniformly Norman, men who owed their positions entirely to William and who could be relied upon to support his policies. This was not reform, it was occupation. The English Church, which had been one of the most vital and independent institutions in pre-conquest England, became an arm of Norman government, staffed by foreigners and oriented toward foreign interests. The human cost of this ecclesiastical revolution was substantial. English monks and nuns found themselves under the authority of Norman superiors who despised English customs, dismissed English saints as provincial obscurities, and viewed the English language itself as barbarous. Ancient liturgical practices specific to English tradition were suppressed in favor of continental norms. Manuscripts in Old English, including works of immense historical and literary value, were neglected or actively destroyed because the Norman clergy could not read them and saw no reason to preserve them. The cult of English saints, figures like Edmund, Edward, and Dunstan, who had been central to English religious life, was marginalized. The English Church, which had possessed its own distinctive character, its own traditions, its own voice, was forcibly assimilated into a Norman ecclesiastical order that viewed Englishness as something to be corrected. The destruction extended to physical structures as well. While William did sponsor the construction of new Norman-style cathedrals and abbey churches, massive Romanesque structures that still dominate the English landscape, these were built alongside, and sometimes literally on top of, demolished Anglo-Saxon churches. The old was systematically replaced by the new, often using stone and materials salvaged from destroyed English buildings. This was architectural colonialism, the imposition of Norman aesthetic and structural principles on a conquered landscape. And it was expensive. The cost borne not by William's treasury, but by the English communities forced to provide labor and materials for churches that represented the physical manifestation of their cultural dispossession. William maintained throughout his life that he was a faithful son of the church, and in Norman territories he was indeed a generous benefactor of religious institutions, but his treatment of the English church reveals the limits of his piety. When ecclesiastical institutions stood in the way of his political and economic interests, he showed no hesitation in violating the sanctity that was supposed to protect them. He plundered when it suited him, taxed when he needed funds, and suppressed when control required it. And he did all of this while maintaining the appearance of Christian devotion, attending Mass regularly, consulting with bishops, making strategic donations to favored monasteries. The contradiction did not escape contemporary observers. They saw a man who honored God with one hand while desecrating God's houses with the other, a ruler who claimed divine sanction for his conquest while treating the church as merely another institution to be subjugated and exploited. The English church had been wealthy, independent, and culturally significant in 1066. By William's death in 1087, it had been stripped of its wealth, subordinated to Norman authority, and largely emptied of its English character. The plunder was complete. The royal forests, a kingdom within a kingdom. Of all the Norman impositions that embittered the English people, few generated more lasting resentment than the creation of the royal forests. In pre-conquest England, woodlands had been resources held in common, places where ordinary people could hunt, gather firewood, graze animals, and forage for food. The forests were not wilderness, but working landscapes, integral to the rural economy. William changed this overnight, declaring vast tracts of land, perhaps a quarter of England's entire territory, to be royal forest, subject to a harsh new legal code that made even the smallest violation punishable by mutilation or death. This was not conservation. It was the privatization of common resources for the exclusive pleasure of a foreign elite, and the English people paid for it with their bodies. Forest law, imported from Normandy and imposed with draconian severity, made the king the sole legal hunter of deer, boar, and other game animals within designated forest areas. This might seem a minor restriction, but its practical impact was catastrophic for rural communities. Hunting had been a crucial supplement to the peasant diet, providing protein in seasons when other food was scarce. Under William's forest law, an Englishman caught hunting a deer in what had been his ancestors' common woodland faced blinding, castration, or amputation of hands or feet. The punishment was not proportional to the crime. It was designed to be so severe that no one would dare risk it, and it worked. The forests became forbidden zones, off-limits to the English, even as Norman nobility hunted there with impunity. The geographic scope of the forest designation was deliberately ambiguous, a tool of oppression disguised as administrative vagueness. Forest did not mean only dense woodland. It was a legal category that could be applied to any land the king chose, including farmland, pasture, even entire villages. Once an area was declared royal forest, it became subject to forest law, which superseded all other legal traditions and customs. Communities that had exercised traditional rights for generations suddenly found themselves criminalized for continuing practices that had been legal the day before. Grazing livestock in a newly designated forest area could result in confiscation of the animals. Cutting firewood could lead to harsh fines or physical punishment. Even walking through forest land without authorization could be treated as trespass. Enforcement was carried out by a new class of royal officials called foresters, Normans, appointed by the king to patrol the forests and punish violators. These men operated with virtually unlimited authority and no accountability. Accusations of forest violations required no evidence beyond the forester's word. Trials, such as they were, took place in special forest courts that recognized no defense based on traditional English rights or customs. The penalties were predetermined and non-negotiable. Contemporary chronicles are filled with bitter descriptions of foresters' abuses, false accusations used to extort bribes, arbitrary seizures of property, assaults on women and girls traveling through forest land, retributive punishments inflicted on entire communities when individual poachers could not be caught. The economic impact of forest law compounded its injustice. Many English villages found themselves partially or entirely within newly designated forest boundaries, which meant that activities essential to survival, gathering deadwood, collecting acorns for pig feed, hunting rabbits, foraging for mushrooms and berries, were now illegal. Peasants who had been self-sufficient found themselves dependent on Norman lords for resources they had previously obtained freely. The lords naturally charged for these resources, further impoverishing communities already struggling under the burdens of Norman taxation and feudal obligations. Forest law effectively created artificial scarcity where none had existed before, transferring wealth from English peasants to Norman elites simply by criminalizing traditional practices. The cruelty of forest law enforcement became legendary. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes mutilated men wandering the roads, victims of forest justice who served as living warnings to others. Blinded poachers became common sights near forest boundaries, deliberately released to spread fear rather than imprisoned. Villages near major royal forests maintained a climate of constant anxiety, knowing that any member of the community might be accused, rightly or wrongly, of forest violations, and that accusation alone was sufficient for punishment. Children were taught from an early age to fear the forests that had once been places of plenty, to see them as dangerous spaces ruled by foreign law and foreign cruelty. William's personal obsession with hunting added a psychological dimension to the oppression. Contemporary sources describe him as fanatically devoted to the chase, spending months of every year in his forests, pursuing deer with an enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in its entry for William's death, famously declared that he loved the deer as if he were their father, and protected them with savage laws that valued animal life above human welfare. This was not hyperbole. William did indeed seem to care more for the preservation of game animals than for the well-being of his English subjects. When faced with the choice between allowing peasants to feed themselves and preserving hunting stock for his own entertainment, he consistently chose the latter. The legacy of William's forest law extended far beyond his reign. His sons and grandsons maintained and even expanded the royal forests, preserving the system of oppression he had created. It would take centuries and events like the Magna Carta's forest clauses before English communities began to regain some of their traditional rights. But the damage was done. An entire generation grew up under a regime where the natural landscape had been weaponized against them, where forests that had sustained their ancestors now represented danger and deprivation. This was perhaps William's most insidious achievement. He had turned England itself into an instrument of English suffering, making the very land complicit in their oppression. The forests stood as permanent monuments to Norman privilege and English dispossession, green spaces reserved for foreign pleasure, while English children went hungry within sight of game they were forbidden on pain of mutilation to hunt. It was cruelty elevated to policy, sustained across generations, justified by nothing more than the conqueror's will. Beyond England, the conqueror's wider campaigns of terror. William's brutality was not confined to England. Before 1066, he had already established a reputation across Normandy and neighboring territories as a ruthless military commander willing to employ terror tactics to achieve his objectives. His campaigns in Maine, Brittany, and against his own Norman rivals revealed patterns of behavior that would later characterize his rule in England. The use of scorched earth tactics, the massacre of civilians, the destruction of entire settlements to punish resistance. The English experience, horrific as it was, represented not an aberration, but an amplification of methods William had honed over decades of continental warfare. William's subjugation of Maine in the 1060s provides a preview of what would come to England. When the county resisted Norman annexation, William responded with systematic devastation. Cities that refused to surrender immediately were besieged, and upon capture, subjected to exemplary punishment. Le Mans, the regional capital, fell to Norman forces after a brutal siege in 1063. Contemporary sources describe widespread destruction and killing, with particular attention paid to humiliating and executing the local nobility who had led the resistance. The parallels to William's later treatment of English nobility are striking. The same combination of military pressure and deliberate terror, the same willingness to destroy what could not be easily controlled. Even within Normandy itself, William's rule was maintained through violence and intimidation. His consolidation of power as Duke of Normandy in the 1040s and 1050s involved suppressing rival Norman barons through military force and calculated cruelty. Castles of rebellious nobles were not just captured, but demolished, their stones scattered to prevent rebuilding. Families of rebels were dispossessed and exiled. William showed no sentimentality toward fellow Normans who opposed him. They received the same harsh treatment as foreign enemies. This internal violence established William's reputation as a man who would tolerate no challenge to his authority, a reputation that served him well when he later invaded England. The siege warfare that characterized William's career deserves particular attention as it reveals his willingness to inflict mass suffering to achieve strategic goals. Medieval sieges were brutal affairs under the best circumstances, but William's sieges were notable for their severity. He was willing to starve entire urban populations to force surrender, a tactic that resulted in the death of thousands of non-combatants. Alençon, besieged by William in 1051 or 1052, allegedly suffered horrific treatment. Sources claim that William, enraged by insults shouted from the walls, ordered the hands and feet of prisoners cut off and catapulted into the city. While the specific details may be embellished, the story's persistence suggests a kernel of truth about William's reputation for extreme cruelty. William's relationship with the church, seemingly pious in public, was revealed to be more complex and self-serving in his wider military campaigns. He was willing to attack ecclesiastical properties when they served strategic purposes or held by enemies. During conflicts with the King of France and other rivals, Norman forces raided monasteries, confiscated church lands, and generally treated religious institutions as fair game when military necessity or financial pressure demanded it. The papal blessing for the English invasion should not obscure the fact that William's relationship with ecclesiastical authority was fundamentally transactional. He supported the church when it served his interests and ignored or violated its principles when they did not. The Welsh borders became another theatre for William's campaigns of terror after the English conquest. Welsh princes who had initially hoped to take advantage of English chaos found themselves facing Norman aggression. William's marcher lords, empowered to expand into Wales, employed the same scorched earth tactics that had proven effective in England. Welsh communities were subjected to raids, villages burned, livestock slaughtered, populations displaced or enslaved. The border regions became militarized zones where Norman fortifications sprouted like mushrooms, and Welsh resistance was met with disproportionate force. This expansion was not defensive. It was offensive conquest, driven by the same hunger for land and power that had motivated the English invasion. Scotland, too, felt the weight of William's military power. King Malcolm III of Scotland had provided shelter to English refugees and made raids into northern England. William's response in 1072 was a massive military invasion that forced Malcolm to submit and pay homage. While this campaign was relatively bloodless compared to others, it demonstrated William's willingness to project force far beyond his secure territories, to punish even perceived slights with overwhelming military displays. The threat was clear. Resistance would be crushed wherever it appeared, regardless of geographical boundaries or diplomatic niceties. By examining William's actions across all theatres of his military career, a consistent pattern emerges. He was not a man who employed extreme measures only when necessary or only against particularly dangerous enemies. He was a leader whose default response to opposition was overwhelming violence, whose strategic toolkit included terror as a standard instrument, whose willingness to inflict civilian suffering knew few limits. The harrying of the North was not an isolated incident of excessive brutality. It was characteristic of a military career built on intimidation and mass punishment. Whether in Maine or England, in Normandy or along the Welsh border, William's message was the same: submit or be destroyed, comply or be obliterated, accept Norman rule or face annihilation. This consistency across time and geography reveals that the horrors inflicted on England were not aberrations caused by the unique circumstances of invasion, but rather the natural expression of William's philosophy of power, that fear was the most reliable foundation for rule, and that no level of cruelty was excessive if it secured obedience. The architecture of terror, psychological warfare, and long-term trauma. Physical conquest is one thing, psychological conquest is another. William the Conqueror understood this distinction with remarkable sophistication for his era. He recognized that military victory alone was insufficient to maintain control over a hostile population that outnumbered his Norman forces by perhaps 50 to 1. Sustained occupation required breaking the conquered people's will, not just their armies. It required instilling such deep fear, such pervasive terror, that resistance would seem not just futile, but suicidal. And so William waged a parallel campaign alongside his military operations, a campaign of psychological warfare designed to shatter English identity, undermine English solidarity, and create a culture of compliance maintained not by constant military presence, but by the internalized trauma of conquest. William's true legacy is not the England that eventually emerged from the conquest, but the England he destroyed, the kingdom of Edward the Confessor, the civilization of Bede and Alfred, the culture preserved in illuminated manuscripts and Anglo-Saxon poetry. That England died in 1066, murdered by a Norman duke who valued power more than life, control more than justice, conquest more than humanity. And for that, history's judgment must be unsparing. William the Conqueror was one of the most effective tyrants of the medieval world, a man who shocked even the brutal age in which he lived, a conqueror whose methods were so terrible that they remain nearly 1,000 years later, a permanent indictment of the cost of unchecked ambition and ruthless will.